Clara Voss was still tied to the Cottonwood when Cole Hatcher rode in over the noon ridge before that morning was over. It would cost 4 of Harlan Cross's men everything they had taken for granted. They were playing cards in the shade across the road, and they were not worried when they saw him. He looked like nothing. A grulla horse the color of old chimney smoke, a canvas duster gone the color of dry creek sand, a black hat with a sweat-ringed brim. The kind of man who drifts through a town and leaves no memory. They went back to their cards. What they did not know, what nobody in Sulfur Flat Crossing knew yet, was that Cole Hatcher was a man whose name, spoken aloud in certain parts of 2 territories, had a habit of changing the room it was spoken in, permanently. They went back to their cards. That was their last comfortable mistake of the summer. Clara had been at that tree since morning. Her wrist was bound to the lowest cottonwood limb with hemp rope, tied just high enough that sitting was possible and standing was not. The sun had been full on her since 10 o'clock without a minute of cloud cover, and the dust under her boots smelled of hot alkali and old horse sweat. 4 of Harlan Cross's men were across the road with their revolvers close enough to reach and a jug of rye between them. They had not come to kill her. That was the point. They had come to leave her where the whole valley could ride past and read the message. And the message was simple. This is what happens when you say no to Harlan Cross. Sign the paper, or the next lesson is worse. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, hit that bell so you never miss a story, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you tonight? What time is it where you sit? Pour yourself something warm. Now let's go back to that dry road through Sulfur Flat Crossing, New Mexico territory, in the summer of 1889, and I'll tell you what happened when the wrong man rode into the wrong town on the worst possible day for Harlan Cross. Sulfur Flat Crossing sat in the high basin country between the Rio Puerco and the old Abiquiu wagon road, a place the geography had never been especially kind to. The soil was hard pan clay packed with alkali dust that coated everything white in dry months and ran off in gray sheets when the rains finally came. The rains came rarely. There were maybe 300 souls within a hard day's ride of Main Street, small ranchers, dry farmers, a few sheepmen, a blacksmith, 2 saloons with the same whiskey at different prices, a telegraph office that had worked intermittently since '77, a church that needed a new roof, and a courthouse that hadn't seen a fair proceeding since Judge Aldous Tanner retired to Santa Fe in '85. What the basin had in abundance was grazing grass out past the southern mesa, a reliable spring that fed 3 draws, and a crossing on the Puerco that every freight outfit between Albuquerque and Farmington needed if they wanted to avoid adding 2 days on the canyon route. That crossing was what Harlan Cross wanted. He wanted everything the crossing touched, everything the water fed, everything a dry land needed to survive. He had been buying it up for 6 years, steady and patient the way a sickness is patient. The ranchers who sold moved on quick. The ones who didn't sell were learning what that cost. Clara Voss was one of the ones who didn't sell. She had come to Sulfur Flat Crossing 9 years before as a bride, trailing her husband Thomas out of San Antonio with a wagon of furniture and the kind of clear-eyed optimism young couples carry into country they have never walked. Thomas was a careful man. He learned the land before he pushed it, rested his animals right, kept his word on a handshake. He built the Voss place on the North Draw, 320 deeded acres with a water right on a spring that ran cold and clean even in August, which was no small thing in that basin. He put up the house himself in river rock and adobe mortar. He planted a kitchen garden that took 3 years to take hold. He intended to be old there. Then, in the spring of '88, a fever came through the valley and took him in 8 days, which was not long enough for Clara to properly believe it while it was happening, and not short enough after it was over for her to stop believing it. She was 27, childless, and alone on 320 acres that Harlan Cross had already been circling for 2 years. Cross sent a letter the following month. 40 cents on the dollar, take it or leave it. Clara wrote back 2 words. Not selling. He sent his foreman out in the fall. A man named Dolan Vickers who smelled of cattle and wore his spurs too loud and had a way of making threats sound like neighborly advice. Clara gave him the same 2 words she had given the lawyer. Not selling. Vickers smiled and predicted she'd feel differently come spring. Her expression made clear what she thought of that prediction. He rode off with his spurs clanking on the porch boards, and she went back inside and wrote down every word of the visit in a journal she kept under a loose hearthstone. Because Clara Voss had made a decision the morning after Thomas died, she was going to fight this with paper. Every insult, every damaged fence post, every false courtesy from a man like Vickers, it all went into the journal. She understood instinctively that people like Harlan Cross depended on their targets, keeping nothing, trusting nothing, building nothing that would hold up in a proper courtroom. She intended to be the exception to that assumption. By spring, Cross had filed a water contest against the Voss spring in Santa Fe, prior appropriation rights that nobody with honest eyes could locate in the territorial records. The case sat in a file drawer. In the meantime, his men rode the north draw fence line at night. Small trouble, carefully calculated. A fence section down here, a water gate jammed there, a post burned just to keep her awake, wondering what was next. Clara fixed each one, wrote down the date and description, and kept going. She had been keeping the Voss place alive through a hard winter and a dry summer, and an active land dispute all by herself, and she had not lost an inch. What she had not planned for was Cross deciding to stop being patient. He sent Vickers and 3 others on a Tuesday morning when Clara was out on the fence line. They took her horse at the gate, tied her wrists, and walked her into town in plain view. Right down the center of Sulfur Flat Crossing's main street at 8 in the morning when the freight wagons were loading and the dry goods store was opening, and every soul in town with eyes could see her. They tied her wrist to the cottonwood at the western edge of town, where the road bent toward Mesa country, and they set up their card game across the road and settled in like men with nothing pressing. By 9 the sun was full on her. By 11 it was serious. The cottonwood gave no shade at that hour. The bark was rough against her spine, and the rope had bit a red line into her wrist inside the first hour. She kept her chin up and her eyes level. Whatever else happened, she was not going to give Dolan Vickers the pleasure of watching her weep. People rode past. Some looked away fast. Some looked too long with helpless expressions that didn't help anyone. An old man named Gerald Peach, who ran the harness shop, walked out of his door, looked at Clara, looked at the 4 men, went back inside, came back out with a tin cup of water, and started across the road. Vickers called over to him from the shade. Gerald Peach stopped in the street with the cup in both hands, and then slowly turned around and went back to his shop. The cup sat on his front step for an hour until a dog drank it. That was the real lesson Cross was teaching. Not just Clara, everyone watching from their windows that morning was doing the arithmetic, calculating what it would cost them to keep saying no. That was the morning Cole Hatcher rode in. He came over the eastern rise near noon, not knowing the town's name and not looking for anything except the water trough and a place to rest his horse. He had been riding since before first light out of a river camp, and he was tired in the specific way months on the road produces, not desperate tired, not broken tired, just empty, like a cup that has been poured too many times. He was 44 years old, and his face showed most of them. 4 days of stubble, a duster that needed new buttons, boots that needed resoling. He looked, from any reasonable distance, exactly like what he was trying to be, a man who had seen enough trouble for one life and was putting miles between himself and it. He saw the cottonwood first. The shape of a person tied to a tree is something a man with his history does not misread. He took in Clara's blue dress, the rope, the raised wrist, the way her head came up at the sound of his horse, then the 4 men in the shade. He read the whole picture in about 3 seconds without changing his pace, counted the guns, noted the positions, watched which of the 4 noticed him first. Dolan Vickers. who leaned back from his cards and looked Cole over with the relaxed confidence of a man who has done ugly things in daylight and never once been made to answer for them. Cole rode to the water trough in front of the livery, let his horse drink, then walked back across the road at a pace that was neither slow nor fast. He stopped in front of the four men. The one nearest him, a thick-necked man named Briggs with a tobacco-dark chin, squinted up. "Move along, old-timer, this ain't your business." Cole looked from Briggs to Clara. "Making it mine." That got a round of exchanged looks, half amusement and half something that hadn't quite decided what it was yet. Vickers stood and hooked his thumbs in his belt. He laid out the situation the way a man does when he thinks the situation is obvious. This was Harlan Cross's business. Private dispute. Keep riding, and nobody would have a problem today. Cole glanced at the rope on Clara's wrist, then back at Vickers. "She's been in the sun 4 hours. Vickers smiled, the particular smile of a man who has mistaken authority over other people for actual importance, and asked if Cole rode for somebody. Just himself, then ride on. Cole did not move. For a long moment he stood there in the noon heat while the horses stamped, and the wind worked the dust in the road and the four men recalculated. Then he walked past them to the Cottonwood. All four came to their feet. Briggs's hand dropped toward his side. Cole stopped in front of Clara. She watched him with eyes that had stopped being surprised by much. Lips cracked from the heat. She didn't speak, and he appreciated that. He took a folded cloth from his duster, wet it from his canteen, and offered it to her. She took it with her free hand, pressed it to her mouth, then looked at him with a quiet and careful expression. "They'll hurt you." He pulled his belt knife and looked back across the road. None of the four had drawn yet. He cut the rope. Briggs cleared leather. What followed took 4 seconds. Cole's colt came out flat and clean, not the showy pull of a man performing, but the plain mechanical speed of someone who had done it 10,000 times and had run out of interest in the ceremony. 1 shot. Briggs's revolver spun out of his hand and into the dirt, and Briggs yanked his hand back and stared at it with the baffled expression of a man looking at something that has stopped working. The other 3 went very still. No second shot, no raised voice, no expression worth mentioning on Cole Hatcher's face. He stood there with the Colt level, the barrel aimed at the center of the group, and looked at Vickers with the steady patience of a man who has nowhere to be. One of the younger ones, maybe 20 years old, maybe not yet, stepped back. His heel caught the jug of rye, and it went over, and the rye ran into the dust, and the boy watched it go as though it were a kind of omen. Pick up his gun. Get him to the doctor. Don't come back to this side of the road. Vickers had not taken his eyes off Cole's face. Something had been trying to arrive in his expression since the shot, a recognition that kept not quite completing itself, like a name on the wrong side of memory. He picked up Briggs's revolver and passed it to the younger man, helped Briggs up. Briggs was swearing quietly and holding his hand to his chest. Vickers gave Cole one last careful look. Then all 4 of them walked around the corner by the livery and were gone. The main street of Sulfur Flat Crossing had gone quiet. Gerald Peach stood in his harness shop doorway with his hands at his sides. The dry goods clerk was on his step. 2 women had come out of the boarding house onto the porch overhang and were standing perfectly still. Cole holstered his Colt and turned to Clara. She was standing with one hand against the cottonwood, watching him not with relief exactly, but with something more careful than relief. The look of a woman who had learned not to trust solutions that arrived too fast. "I need to get back to my ranch." "Not alone." "I've been going back alone for a year." He picked up his hat from the fence post where he'd rested it and put it back on. "Do places north draw?" She looked at him more closely. He read the look and got ahead of it. "Guessing by the road that's the direction they brought you from. I'll ride the first mile. After that, it's your choice." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded, and they walked to the livery. The livery boy handed over her dun mare without a word of argument. That told Cole what the whole town already understood about the morning. The ride north was quiet. Clara rode ahead and Cole kept enough distance to be respectful, which meant something in that country. The land opened from town into a broad, pale basin, ringed by low mesas, the road running through Chamisa, going gray-green in the summer heat. The Voss place appeared after 2 miles, a solid rock and adobe house with a proper well, a barn built right and starting to need paint, a kitchen garden that had actually survived the season, and a fence line that showed real attention, the work of someone patient. Someone who was planning to still be here. Clara unsaddled her mare in the barn without asking for help. She looked at Cole across the horse's back. "You're not from this county." "No." A beat while she hung the saddle. "Cross's men will be at his ranch by sundown." "I expect so. He won't let this morning sit." "No." She looked at him then with the directness that women develop after too long fighting alone. No time left for the sideways approach. "Who are you?" Cole looked at the middle distance. The question had never had a clean answer. "Just a man who needed water for his horse," was the answer he tried. She wasn't buying it. Her husband had once hired a hand with a reputation, she said, and she had seen men draw quick, and she had never seen anyone move the way Cole had moved. She wasn't afraid of him. She wanted that established before he considered lying to her. She needed to know what she was dealing with, because whatever was coming tonight, she needed to be dealing with it clearly. Cole was quiet for a beat longer than was comfortable. Cole Hatcher. The name landed in the barn the way a stone lands in water. Clara watched him. Her expression didn't change, which was how he knew she recognized it. In the territory in '89, Cole Hatcher was not a name that needed explaining to anyone who had been reading the dispatches from the lower Rio Grande since '79. He had worn a badge 3 times in 3 different counties, and in between he had done the kind of work that doesn't carry a badge but still keeps certain men from sleeping easy. The story most people told was the Becker Flats business in '84, where 4 hired guns had cornered a homesteader family in a canyon south of Tucumcari, and Cole had ridden in and come out the other side with all 4 horses and the family on them, and none of those 4 hired guns had ever reported back to their employer. Nobody had pushed too hard on the details of how. There were other stories. There always were. "I heard you were in Texas," Clara said at last. "I was." Horse needed water. She looked at him another moment. Then she walked out of the barn toward the house, and after a moment he followed. Because his horse needed a night's rest, and he had a feeling about what the next 24 hours were going to look like. The house was orderly. A kitchen table with a kerosene lamp, a stone fireplace, a shelf of books with a Bible at one end, and an almanac from '87 at the other. On the table sat a stack of papers. Clara made no move to put away or apologize for ledgers, land filings, hand-copied survey maps, a stack of letters with county seals on them. Cole's jaw tightened slightly when he glanced at them. She set water to boil and cut bread and put dried beans on without asking whether he was staying. He sat at the table and watched her move around her kitchen with the economy of someone who has been doing it alone for a long time. "Tell me about Harlan Cross." She did. She was a precise woman with a precise memory, and she told it flat, no embellishment, which Cole found more troubling than if she had been frightened. 6 years of systematic land acquisition. Small ranchers pressed off their property through forged water contests, manipulated tax filings, nights of harassment that never crossed into anything you could take to court, and a county sheriff named Denton Ware who held his badge at Cross's pleasure. 3 families she knew personally who had left within the past year. The water contest against the Voss Spring, which she had already challenged twice in the Territorial Land Office with documentation she had assembled herself. A surveyor from Albuquerque who came out to verify the spring boundaries and then, 3 weeks later, amended his survey in Cross's favor in a filing Clara believed had been purchased. "I have proof," she said, not the way frightened people say it, as a hope. the way methodical people say it, as a thing they have been building quietly for a long time. The original land patent, the 81 water right documentation, a copy of the surveyor's first report before it was changed, sent by a Santa Fe clerk before that clerk was replaced. 14 months of dated harassment records. A sworn statement from a homesteader named Frank Hawley who had watched stolen Vickers hand money directly to the county tax assessor. Frank had moved his family to Colorado in March. He mailed the statement before he left. Cole looked at the stack of papers. They know you have it. They know I have something. That's why today was a rope to a tree and not something worse. The message is, sign the transfer or find out what comes after the tree. The lamp sat between them, steady in the still air. Outside, the wind moved through the chamissa, and somewhere past the fence a coyote tested the dark. Cole turned his coffee cup in his hands. He had been through 3 counties in 12 months, moving west the way a man moves when he is less going somewhere than leaving somewhere, putting distance between himself in a stretch of years that had cost him more than he wanted to examine. He had told himself on the road into New Mexico that he was done with other people's trouble. He had believed it for the better part of 6 months. He looked at Clara's papers and at her hands still marked red from the rope, and he understood, with the resigned clarity of a man who knows his own character better than he would prefer, that he was not going to ride on in the morning. What do you need? Clara looked at him steadily. Documentation to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe, a letter she had sent 3 months ago that she believed had been intercepted, never answered. A rider to the telegraph relay station at Mesilla, 60 miles north, who wasn't connected to Vickers's people, and someone to hold the property for whatever time it took for a response to come. How many men does Cross have? Vickers ran 8 or 10 regulars. Cross kept another 6 at his main spread, the Rook Cantera Ranch southeast of town. The county sheriff, Denton Ware, had 4 deputies and Cross's money under his badge. 20-some men. Yes. He was quiet a moment. You're not scared. I'm terrified. She said it simply, with no particular emotion. But I've been terrified for 14 months, and it hasn't changed what I have to do. I've mostly stopped talking about it. Cole drank his coffee. The coyote had moved off west. The night was dark and quiet. He thought about a canyon south of Tucumcari, and about the particular look on a man's face the moment he realizes the arithmetic has changed. He had told himself he was done more times than he could count, and the road kept delivering him to places where being done turned out not to be an available option. We won't make it to morning without a visit, he said. Vickers will have ridden to Cross by now. Cross is embarrassed, and men like that don't wait. Tonight, most likely. Clara went to the fireplace. She reached up to the mantel and lifted down a double-barrel shotgun that had been resting against the stone. Broke it, checked the loads, snapped it closed, set it on the table. Cole almost smiled. I expect you do. He went outside and spent an hour walking the property in the dark, reading it the way he had learned to read every piece of ground he ever had to hold. The house sat on a slight rise with clear ground on 3 sides. A silent approach would be difficult. The barn was close enough to be a problem if taken. The well sat between the house and the barn. A root cellar behind the kitchen, accessible from inside and out. He found the spots he would choose if he were coming in from outside, then figured out what he could use to make those spots unpleasant. Back inside, he asked about the root cellar, canned goods, a case of nails, 3 empty barrels. He needed wire, 30 feet if she had it, and anything that made noise. Clara pointed him to the tackle box in the barn. Brass bells on the mule harness in there, she said without expression. He went back to the barn and worked in the dark without a lamp. He strung a thin trip wire across the 2 most obvious approach lines at shin height, tied off to the brass harness bells hung against the inside barn wall. Anyone moving quiet along the fence line in the dark would find the wire with their shins before they found it with their eyes. He cached shells in 3 spots: barn, front porch step, behind the well housing. Because in a real siege, what kills men faster than any gun is running short at the wrong moment. He braced the root cellar door from inside with a beam and 2 iron brackets from the tack room, not planning to hide there. Planning to have a second option if the first one ran out. Back inside, Clara was at the kitchen table making a duplicate set of everything, copying ledger entries and filing dates and names onto flour sack paper by lamplight, her handwriting steady as a surveyor's. He watched her a moment. "You've been doing this a while." "For months. Copies go to 3 people, Judge Aldous Tanner in Santa Fe, a lawyer in Albuquerque named Reuben Garth, and my husband's cousin in Denver. If something happens to me, the evidence keeps going." She tied the packet with twine. "That's why I'm still alive. Cross knows if he kills me, the documentation goes everywhere." Cole sat down across from her. The lamp was steady. A good lamp is worth more than people think in the dark hours. There was something she should know about him, he said, before the night got complicated. Clara's hand stayed on the papers. She wasn't interested in reformed, she let him know, unless it had changed what he'd do in the next 12 hours. He nodded. He told her about the 3 years of moving, not from danger, from something worse. From the shape of a particular failure in a county in Texas that he could still feel the edges of when he lay awake. He had kept order in that county without a badge for 2 years, and then an incident had gotten away from him, no killing, but the kind of damage a man does to his own character when he acts from anger instead of judgment, and he had left before they could ask him to stay, which they would have. He hadn't slept right in 6 months. He was telling her because the man across the table from her had a reason to stay that wasn't entirely about the justice of her situation, and she deserved to know that. Clara looked at him. "What is it about, then, not adding another name to the list of people I left before I should have?" The lamp burned between them. She looked at him with the attention of a woman who has learned to read the gap between what men say and what they mean, and whatever she found there, she accepted it. All right. She tied off the second packet and set it beside the first. The first tripwire bell rang at 11:30. Cole was at the window before the sound finished. Thin cloud cover, enough moon to read shapes in the pale dust of the yard. 3 men moving along the north fence, a 4th at the barn corner. He told Clara quietly to stay low and stay inside. Her name called meant come to the kitchen door with the shotgun, not before. She didn't answer, which was the right answer. He went out through the root cellar, came up behind the barn. The man at the corner hadn't heard the bell, or had heard it, and decided it was an animal. Cole moved along the back wall until he was 4 feet from the corner. He could hear the man breathing, the small sound of a boot testing the ground. "Whoever you are," Cole said, from the dark, "you're about to make a mistake." The man spun, and Cole hit him once across the jaw with the barrel of the Colt, not hard enough to do lasting damage. Hard enough to sit him down in the dust and keep him there. He went down without a sound. The 3 along the north fence heard the thud and went still. Cole moved into the open between the barn and the house. He didn't raise his voice much, but he carried it. 4 men went out of this yard tonight, one of them sleeping behind the barn. 3 of you are standing at a fence line working out whether the arithmetic still adds up. Go back to Cross and tell him the answer is still no. Tell him I'll be here when he comes himself." A long silence. A horse shifted somewhere in the dark. A boot scraped dust. Then 3 men moving back through the brush toward the road, not running, but not taking their time either. He waited in the yard 20 minutes. Nothing else came. He dragged the man by the barn around to the front gate and propped him against the post with his revolver tucked back in his belt, but empty. Because there was no reason to leave a man defenseless in the night, even if he worked for the wrong outfit. Then he went back inside. Clara was at the kitchen door with the shotgun. "You didn't fire. No need." She looked past him into the dark. "How many?" 4. 3 went back. "One's at the gate." She lowered the shotgun. Cole could see the adrenaline going through her hands, but her face stayed level. a woman who had been managing fear for a long time. He'll come with more tomorrow. Yes. A short pause. Will you still be here? Cole looked around the kitchen. The lamp on the table, the neat stacks of paper tied with twine, the shotgun in Clara Voss's hands. Yes. He meant it in the way a man means a thing when he has stopped calculating it and moved into the part where it is simply true. He took the first watch, and she slept in the chair by the fireplace with the shotgun across her knees. And by 4 a.m. she woke him and sent him to the back room cot, because a man who hasn't slept isn't useful. He was up again at first light, standing at the kitchen window with coffee when she came in from outside with her hair pinned up and the day already on her. We need a rider to Masilla. Who do you trust in town? She thought about it. A boy who worked the livery, Arturo, 15 years old, not in Cross's pocket because Cross didn't pay attention to 15-year-old boys. He'd ridden 60 miles on a dare once. He could do it with a reason. Cole worked out the timing, noon, not morning. Morning was when Vickers watched the road. Cross would arrive himself before noon, which meant Vickers would have other things to occupy him. Noon gave the boy a clear path north. Clara nodded and went to the writing table. Cole spent the morning making the property harder to take. He moved the empty barrels into the barn door opening and weighted them with rocks so they couldn't be shoved wide fast. Cached a second box of shells behind the well housing. Reinforced the root cellar door. He was not a man who believed in waiting for trouble to define the terms of the fight. At 10 a.m, Gerald Peach came up the road on a bay mule with a wrapped parcel and the embarrassed expression of a man who knows he owes something. He stopped at the gate and looked at Cole on the porch. She all right? Come in and ask her. He sat at the kitchen table and put the parcel down, a ham shank, a bag of dried corn, and looked at Clara with the face of a man who had been carrying something since yesterday morning. He should have kept walking to that tree with the water cup. He was sorry. Clara's answer was simple. He was here now. Gerald looked at his hands, then mentioned he was an old man, as if that explained the rest of it. Cole from the doorway pointed out that old men could ride well enough when there was a reason. Gerald looked at him. Something passed across the old man's face, recognition working itself out, landing somewhere between awe and decision. Clara put the first documentation packet on the table. She explained about Emil Rother, the county commissioner in Bernalillo who had been asking quiet questions about the water filing since January, who was not Cross's man and might be the key to getting a formal inquiry opened, if someone could reach him with this. Gerald looked at the packet, then at his hands, then at Cole Hatcher in the doorway. He took the packet. I can be in Bernalillo by tomorrow morning. By 11 o'clock, others had come. Crow Bates with his wife, arriving on a wagon from the East Puerco homestead. Because news moves fast through small valleys and something had shifted in the morning that had been wanting to shift for a while. Then Ira Pelt, an older man whose hayfields had been cut off from water access for 6 months. Then Sarah Trujillo, who ran sheep north of the mesa and arrived with a rifle and a face like a closed door. None of them said anything especially heroic. They found places around the property and waited. Cole moved among them quietly, learning names, placing each one where they could be useful without being exposed. At noon, Clara sent Arturo north on a fresh horse with the second documentation packet, a letter for the territorial marshal's office, and $30 from her own savings tucked into his shirt pocket as the reason to ride fast. At noon, Harlan Cross came down the road. He came with Dolan Vickers and 8 riders and a wagon with 2 armed men in the bed. Broad daylight, its own statement. He had not come to negotiate. He had come to finish it before supper. He rode a black horse that was too fine for the country and wore a clean white shirt and a black coat, despite the heat, and a pearl-handled revolver that Cole was fairly certain had never been fired in anger. Cross was 55, heavy in the shoulders, with a white-streaked beard and the particular stillness of a man who had been paying other people to be violent for so long he had started to feel personally invulnerable. I've known men like Harlan Cross. They don't raise their voices much. They hire louder men. Cole stood in the yard when the gate opened. Behind him, at the barn corner, on the porch, along the east fence, the people of Sulfur Flat Crossing who had come that morning were visible and not hiding. Gerald Peach was already south on the road to Bernalillo. Arturo was 30 miles north. But Ira Pelt was at the barn corner with a rifle, and Sarah Trujillo was on the porch, and Crow Bates and his wife were at the east fence, and every one of them was in plain sight. Cross looked at the yard and the people in it, and Cole Hatcher in the center, and his face ran a calculation. He pulled up 20 feet short. "You're Cole Hatcher." Cole allowed that he was. Cross's voice stayed even, educated, the voice of a man who had learned that calm sounds like authority. He laid it out. Cole had no stake in this county, no reason to be here, and could ride out this morning with his horse and his health, and nobody would remember his name by sundown. "I've been remembered in worse places," Cole said. Vickers was watching from 6 feet to Cross's left, and Cole could see what had been working in Vickers's expression since the day before finally arrive, the full recognition, complete. Cross leaned on his pommel. That business down south with the Bell family, that was a different territory, a different time. You can't be everywhere. I don't need to be, just here. Cross looked at the people around the yard. He looked at the kitchen window where Clara had left the documentation packets visible on the table. He looked at Cole. "What do you want?" Not a question. The first note of negotiation from a man who had run out of better positions. Cole told him plainly the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe had been contacted. The county commissioner in Bernalillo had been contacted. The evidence of forged water claims, fraudulent tax filings, and bribery was already on its way to 3 separate destinations. If Cross rode onto this property today and took anything or harmed anyone, that evidence would reach a federal judge in Santa Fe by end of week, and a United States Marshal would ride south with it the following Monday. The yard went quiet enough to hear the chamissa move. A horse flicked an ear. "That's a lot of faith in a mail system," Cross said. "It's not faith. The boy's a day ahead of you already." Cross looked at Vickers. Vickers said nothing. Cross looked back at Cole and tried the water contest filing, which was a matter of territorial record. Cole came back with the original Voss water right from 81, the surveyor's first report before it was amended, and the payment record from Emil Rother's inquiry. Cross's face went very still at that last one. He tried Rother being a businessman and not a legal authority. Cole pointed out that a county commissioner's inquiry made the falsified documents in it a criminal matter, not a civil one. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a man realizes he has run out of maneuvering room. Dolan Vickers looked at Cross. Cross looked at his pearl-handled revolver, not reaching for it, just looking at it the way a man looks at a tool that has become suddenly less useful than expected. 20 families in this valley depend on Rocantera for their livelihoods, Cross said, the voice of a man trying out his last argument. From the porch, Clara said, 20 families depend on the water in this valley. You own that water because you stole it. That isn't a livelihood. That's a leash. Cross looked at her. Something crossed his face then that was more honest than anything he had said all morning. He tried one more time, turning to the yard with the practiced calm of a man who had built a territory on making people feel dependent. Without Rocantera, cattle don't ship. Freight doesn't move. Wages don't come. His last and strongest lie, not innocence, but necessity. Clara answered before Cole could. You fenced this valley. That's not the same as building it. The yard stirred. An old man in the back shifted his weight. A woman covered her mouth. Cole kept his voice low. The choice Cross had was simple. Ride back to Rocantera and wait for a territorial proceeding that would go in misses. Voss's favor when the evidence arrived, or push further on a property full of people who were tired of being afraid of him. He let that sit. I'd take the first choice. You'll sleep better. For a long moment Harlan Cross sat on his fine black horse in the pale noon light, with 8 armed men behind him and the arithmetic going the wrong way. And he did what powerful men do when the arithmetic finally turns on them. He looked for a face to blame, found none that suited him, and turned his horse. He rode back out through the gate without another word. Vickers gave Cole one long last look, then turned and followed. The wagon followed. The gate stayed open and the dust settled in the road, and the road was empty. Nobody in the yard said anything for a moment. Ira Pelt, from the barn corner, "I'll be damned." Sarah Trujillo, from the porch, "Don't count it finished yet." She was right. And this is a good moment to pause and say, if you've been listening tonight and you feel that particular charge in your chest when a story tips toward justice, take 1 second and press the subscribe button. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are right now, what time it is, where you sit, what the weather's like. I love hearing from folks all over. Now stay with me, because Sarah Trujillo was right, and the next 2 weeks were not simple. Cross retreated to Rook Cantera, which was what it looked like on the surface. A man does not build 6 years of illegal acquisition and abandon it in a morning because a gunslinger gave him a hard look in a yard. Within 48 hours he had a lawyer in Santa Fe filing an emergency injunction to block review of the Voss water contest. He sent Vickers south to Bernalillo to intercept Gerald Peach. But Gerald had left the documentation with Emil Rother the previous evening and was already halfway back. He sent a man to Masilla to delay the telegraph relay, but Arturo had transmitted the message 2 days prior and was already riding home with a receipt in his shirt pocket. Every move Cross made arrived 1 day too late. That has a particular kind of justice to it if you have the patience to wait it out. Clara Voss had been building toward this moment for 14 months. Cross had been assuming she would run out of patience before he ran out of power. He was wrong about which one of them had the longer supply of either. Cole stayed. He told himself it was to make sure the property held through the legal proceedings, and that was partly true. There were still 2 weeks ahead where Cross's lawyers could make real trouble, and a fence line with Cole Hatcher on it was a different proposition than one without him. But there was also something in the evenings at the Voss place. The kerosene lamp on the table, the scratch of Clara's pen moving through the papers, coffee on the stove, the night wind working through the chamisa. That it stopped feeling like a stranger's house sometime in the second week, and started feeling like something he was not going to examine too carefully, because he had a long history of ruining things by examining them. Clara did not ask him to stay. She did not suggest he should go. She put a second chair at the kitchen table and cooked enough supper for 2, and went on with her work, and he went on with his. In the evenings they talked. She told him about Thomas Voss, the good years, the careful building of the property, and the 8 days in the spring of '88, which she described with brevity and precision, because it was still too close to circle around. Cole listened. He had always been better at listening than at comfort, and he had learned that for people who had been fighting alone a long time, being listened to by someone who stayed awake was its own kind of comfort. He told her about the county in Texas, the 2 years of keeping order without a badge, the incident that had gotten away from him. He had left before they could ask him to stay, which they would have done. She turned her coffee cup in her hands and thought about that. It sounded like he needed to be somewhere else, she said. He looked at the lamp. Not somewhere else, somewhere that needed something he still had. There was a difference, and he had spent 3 years not understanding it. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the night was quiet, and the chamisa was still, and even the coyote had settled. The territorial marshal arrived on a Wednesday, 10 days after Arturo had ridden north. His name was Porter. Steady, methodical, the kind of man who doesn't get excited but also doesn't stop. He came with 2 deputies and a federal writ, served Sheriff Denton Ware with a notice of federal inquiry at the county courthouse, and Ware cooperated with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for someone official enough to give him a reason to stop serving Harlan Cross. The investigation took 3 months. Cole stayed for most of it. He was not the legal mechanism. Marshal Porter needed Clara's documentation, not his gun, and Clara's documentation was in perfect order. Cole was there because there were 2 weeks in the middle of the investigation when Cross's lawyers pushed through an injunction that would have let Cross's men back onto the south pasture pending outcome, and the injunction held for 4 days before Emil Rother's formal complaint got it reversed. During those 4 days, Dolan Vickers came twice to the Voss fence line in the early morning, and both times found Cole sitting on the top rail with a coffee cup and the Winchester across his knees. And both times Vickers turned his horse around and went back to Rip Cantera without a word. That was the work Cole did for 3 months. Not the legal work, the fence rail work. It turned out to matter. Harlan Cross was charged in September. Fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of county officials, unlawful seizure. The trial ran 4 months in Santa Fe. Cross's lawyers were good. The evidence was better. Denton Ware testified and got a reduced sentence for it. Edwin Cook, the county tax assessor, testified and did not. The Albuquerque surveyor testified last, with the shaking hands of a man who had been carrying the weight of what he'd done for 2 years, and what he said was clean and complete and sufficient. The water contest against the Voss spring was withdrawn. The south pasture went back on the Voss deed. 2 neighboring families got their contested properties reviewed. Ira Pelt's hayfields got their water access restored before winter. Justice came the way it always does, not like a wave, but like water finding its level through every small channel available to it, slow and inevitable once it started moving. Cole was in the yard the morning the marshal's letter arrived confirming the Voss water right. Clara came out onto the porch and read it twice, then stood in the morning light with her hands at her sides. "It's done. For now," Cole said, because he was an honest man. "For now," she agreed. He had been putting off what he had to say for 2 weeks, finding reasons to let another day pass. He walked to the porch and took off his hat. He had been thinking about Colorado, he said. County work up in the mountain country if a man wanted it. Clara looked at him with an expression that was not surprised and not hurt. The look of a woman who had been expecting that particular sentence long enough to prepare for it. All right. The place was solid, he said. The legal standing was solid. She didn't need someone on the fence rail anymore. No, she agreed. He turned his hat in his hands. He had left people before, and every time the leaving had felt like this, not quite right, not quite wrong. The uneasy equilibrium of a man who hasn't yet figured out whether moving is his nature, or just his habit. Or I could fix the south fence, he said. That section by the draw needs 2 new posts. Clara looked out at the Chamisa field and the pale basin and the road running north toward the mesa and south toward town. And then she looked at the man standing at her porch step with his hat in his hands and the dust on his boots and the expression of someone who has run out of reasons to keep moving and is beginning to suspect that is not a failure. The barn door needs a new hinge too, she said. He put his hat back on. I'll start with the fence posts. She went inside to put coffee on. He went to the barn for the post hole digger. And the morning opened up ahead of them the way mornings do when a person has stopped waiting for them to be something other than what they are. Now, I want to say something as we come to the end of this story, because there is something in it I have been sitting with since I first heard it told. We talk a lot in this country, and always have, about the man with the gun, the one who rides in and changes the arithmetic. Cole Hatcher was that man, no question. He was fast and steady, and he knew how to make a situation harder for the people causing it. But the ground everything stood on, the reason the documentation arrived, and the marshal responded, and the court had something real to hold. Every bit of that was built by Clara Voss across 14 months of careful, methodical, unglamorous work in a house where nobody was going to help her if she stopped. The gun matters. The paper matters more. A man with a Colt can hold a fence line for a morning. A woman with a ledger can hold a valley for a generation. Cross had 20 men and a sheriff in his pocket, and 6 years of crooked filings behind him, and he still lost. He lost because Clara Voss had been writing everything down. He assumed a widow alone on 300 acres, with a contested water, right, and a bad year behind her would be easier to break than a mountain. He was wrong. He looked at her and saw surrender instead of patience. He didn't understand until too late that patience in a righteous person is its own kind of strength, quiet, stubborn, and very nearly impossible to exhaust. I'm an old man now. I've seen a lot of country and a lot of trouble. The thing I know most surely after all of it is this: the man with the gun is not always the most dangerous person in the room. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has been quietly keeping records for 14 months, while everyone else looked the other way. Don't look away. That's what looking away costs. If this story sat well with you tonight, leave a like and a comment. Tell me which part stayed with you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Until our trails cross again, friend, keep your powder dry and your soul honest. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the history of the American frontier. All characters and events are imaginary, created with the assistance of artificial intelligence for storytelling purposes.